Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me whilst I adjust my scarf. Welcome to another Warframe guide. Today we're looking at the Delight of Titania. Now I was going to make a guide on this lovely lady about a week or two ago, but as it turns out, they were going to do a rework on her for the Fortuna 2.0 update, so I decided to hold off on it. I've recently discovered the Delight of Titania and her super amazing blitzy powerfulness. Now, the changes they've made to her are fairly decent, and there's going to be a link in the description of the stream to the changes made, so I'd highly recommend giving them a look if you haven't already. This will sort of go over everything that has been changed, everything that's updated, and what has been added. I'm not going to specifically tailor to each individual change, however, just know that some of these abilities have been changed from what they were a couple of weeks ago. Titania as a frame. She is a very interesting little pixie angel thing. Titania is obtained from a very lengthy and very long drawn-out quest line, which will probably make you tear your hair out with how grindy it is. The quest is obtained from the new Locust Syndicate within the relays. You talk to the new local leader, she gives you the quest, and then you go off and you do the quests. These quests are these quests, honestly, they are a pain. They're not hard, they're just a pain. It'll basically ask you to go pick a bunch of flowers. And I'm not joking here, but this will very likely take a couple of days to pick the flowers, because some of them will come up at certain times of day on certain planets. But that's a thing for another video. That entire quest could be an entirely different guide in of itself. If you want to check that out, there's a lot of information on the wiki. When you get to the certain segments, just look up where the flowers come from. That's what you got to do. So, the construction of Titania, once you have obtained all of her quest lines and you've completed it and you got her blueprint, the construction of Titania with all the individual pieces will cost you, and there'll be a little flare up here somewhere showing you exactly what you need. You will need 70,000 credits, 1,500 alloy plates, 2 neurodes, 2,500 polymer bundles, 700 circuits, 3 nitane, 3,000 ferrite, 900 rubido, 2 tellurium, 1 control module, 800 plastids, 2,200 cryotic, 3 arcan cells, and a crap load of patience. In terms of base stats, Titania has 300 HP at level 30, 300 shields at level 30, 65 armor at level 30, 100 energy with a sprint speed of 1.0, with 2 polarity slots in her regular slots and a aura polarity in her aura slot as well. Titania's abilities. The passive is Dust Bloom. Dust Bloom grants Titania 25% bullet jump distance. Every time Titania does a bullet jump, it will generate a patch of dust on the ground that she jumped from in the same color as your energy. Any ally that stands within this dust will then gain the same jump distance buff, the dust bloom, sorry, and the dust itself that is generated lasts for 5 seconds, which in turn allows you to generate a form of utility for your team for being able to get around more smoothly and quicker and further and jumpingness, yeah! Titania's one is Spellbind. Bind? Yes, Spellbind. Titania scatters dust in a 5-meter area up to 50 meters away from her. Enemies within the area affected will be tethered in place and start floating weightlessly like a majestic ballerina in the area they were positioned. They drop their weapons and are unable to act or do anything of that nature, basically like me on prom night. They will then float in the air for 16 seconds, and if this ability is cast within the area of an ally, that ally will then gain status immunity for the same amount of time. Enemies affected by Spellbind will then float away in the trajectory of their momentum. So if they are running forwards, or they've been affected by a blast radius of some kind, they'll then float off in that direction as well. Now, this isn't something you particularly need to worry about, but bear in mind that if an enemy is moving fast or they've been affected by a knockback of some kind, they'll then start floating in that direction. So you're never going to really be able to keep them in one singular location. This ability is quite fun. It's a pretty damn decent form of crowd control. You can cast it almost as many times as you want to have as many enemies floating away in very prancy-like state as you want. The cast range and the radius of the effect is affected by your ability range, and the duration of the crowd control is then affected by your duration as well. Tribute is Titania's 2. Tribute blasts an enemy within 25 meters, dealing 500 damage on initial cast. The enemy is then going to have their soul ripped from their body, much like a really awesome anime, and that soul will then be in place for 15 seconds. If the target survives, their damage output is reduced by 25% for 12 seconds. So if they don't die from the initial cast, they become weaker. Now, this spirit form is basically a standing buff. And the buffs in Tail are different based on the enemy you use it on. There are 4 different buffs that you can get, and it is entirely dependent on the enemy you use them on. So different situations will give you different buffs. And these can also be picked up as a beneficial stat for your allies as well. The 4 buffs in Tail are Dust. The Dust Aura reduces the accuracy of enemies within a 30-meter radius, around Titania for 50%, for 120 seconds. Thorns. Thorns will create an aura that will reflect 50% of the damage dealt back at the attacker up to 40 meters away for 120 seconds. Any allies within 35 meters of Titania will also benefit from Thorn's reflection as well. Entangle will cause enemies within a 10-meter radius to be slowed by 25% and for 120 seconds. And then Full Moon, which is a sort of pet beneficial buff. The Full Moon increases the damage of all companions, sentinels, mowers, and etc., as well as Titania's butterflies, which is something we'll cover later, by 75% for 90 seconds. Any teammates are also then affected by this buff as well, buffing their companions with a similar buff. The direct damage of Tribute itself is affected by power strength, the duration of the buff is affected by duration, and the cast range of this is then affected by range as well. Something to note as well, all of Titania's abilities for the most part are affected by natural talent and cast speed mods. Titania's 3 is Lantern. Lantern is an ability that can be cast on an enemy within 25 meters. This enemy will then be hoisted into the air and converted into a portable lantern. Enemies within a 20-meter radius will then be pacified and also infatuated by this majestic floating creature. Enemies within a 2.5-meter radius will take a 350 damage every second tick, as well as being then kind of incapacitated and just not able to take part in combat. The damage of the dot that is dealt by the lantern is based on power strength. The duration of the target being suspended by lantern is based on power duration. The cast range and the damage radius of the tick is then also affected by range as well. Now, activating your 3 a second time and holding down will then cause the lantern to explode, dealing 2,500 damage to itself and any enemy within a 8-meter radius. Now, the radius of the explosion is based on power range, and the damage that explosion then deals is also based on power strength. This is quite nice damage, especially for lower targets, and even at the higher levels, it can be very potent as a in synergy with your 1, allowing you to deal lots of damage and keeping enemies under control. Titania's augment for Lantern is called Beguiling Lantern. Beguiling Lantern is a very simple augment. Enemies affected by Lantern and their buff therein will then take 100% bonus damage from melee attacks. This can be used for allies as well as a form of utility. It's a very simple augment, very useful for just upping the damage of your group. And the more Lanterns you have, the more enemies can be affected and the more damage they'll then take. Titania's 4 is Razorwing. Razorwing converts Titania down into a mini version of herself, which controls much like an Arcwing. In fact, it has the exact same controls as an Arcwing as if it was on planes of Eidolon or Fortuna. Whilst in this state, Titania then gains 50% evasion from melee attacks and ranged attacks, and gains 2 new weapons whilst sacrificing her old ones. By sacrificing, I mean you just can't use them in this state. The main weapon is Dex Pixia, and then you have a melee weapon, which is the Dewata. Both of these weapons can be modded, much like a regular weapon from your inventory, and we'll go into the builds for those in just a moment. Now, in this mode, Titania is able to fly around at a high rate of knots and then deal damage as she wishes to. The damage that these weapons do. The Dex Pixia as a default has 160 damage per shot. The base damage is 80% slash based, with 200% crit damage, 10% crit chance, and 25% status chance. The damage of both her Dex Pixia and the Dewata are somewhat affected by power strength, the ratio of which is not the leading factor of the damage, but the build you use for these weapons will be. The Dewata is the melee weapon in this mode. The Dewata has 200 damage as a base amount of damage, and the damage is also affected by power strength, much like the Dex Pixia. The damage is 75% based on impact damage, then evenly split between the other damage types. The attack speed is 1.8 with a 200% crit damage and 20% crit chance. This is essentially a two-handed sword, much like regular Arcwing weapons, and controls very similarly. The other benefit of being in this Arcwing mode is you summon little tiny butterflies. These are 6 little drones that will summon around you whilst you're in this mode that will deal damage to enemies that you come within range of. They deal 80 damage as a default, and much like the Dewata and the Dex Pixia, the damage these little butterflies deal is based on your power strength. If these butterflies die, which they can, they will not regenerate until you recast your Razorwing, and they can add quite a marginal amount of difference damage, especially at the lower levels. Flight speed in this mode is affected by any movement speed mods such as Rush or Speed Drift, for example, and the drain of your energy is affected by efficiency, so building efficiency will allow you to be in this mode for much, much longer. Razorwing's augment is called Razorwing Blitz. Razorwing's Blitz increases flight speed by 25% and fire rate by 25% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 4 times when using abilities. This is an amazing augment that makes your damage go from being amazing to being absolutely phenomenal. Now, the stack of this can cause the damage of your Titania to become ludicrous. It does mean you're going to burn through your ammo very quickly, so you're going to have to be very careful as how much ammo you burn through before you run out. But, as you're seeing from this, the second you get that stack up to full, the damage you're able to deal is immeasurable. And it is probably one of the highest impacting augments of any augment in the game. Now, something to keep in mind is it does also affect the attack speed of your melee weapon as well as the Dex Pixia, and can tremendously increase the overall damage of your frame. So if you bring viral damage, you're going to be proccing viral every 5 seconds. If you build for crit damage, the shots themselves are just going to be going off so incredibly quickly that you will just blast anything down. This augment, if you're going for a Razorwing build, is pretty much mandatory. Or if you want to make the most of your Razorwing build. Nothing in this stage is essentially mandatory, but if you want to make the most of your Pixie mode, get this augment. A couple quick things to note is that Titania's Arcwing mode can be affected by certain passives and arcanes. Things like Arcane Velocity, for example, which increases fire rate by a percentage, and also certain passives of weapons like Arca-Skizko. I realize I've said that completely wrong. Don't judge me. So, when you are in the Arcwing mode, or the Razorwing mode, Arca-Skizko's passive can be stacked much like it would do on its own. Arca-Skizko giving up to 20% crit chance and 20% status chance once at full stacks. Combining that then with Razorwing Augment and Arcane Velocity, you're going to be pumping out a metric crud ton of damage. Now to look at Titania's builds. In terms of the aura polarity, you can essentially use whatever. If you don't have Arcane Energize to hand, I would recommend Energy Siphon. But if you do have Arcane Energize, then basically the world's your oyster. Corrosive Projection is always a good choice. Now, the way we look at this is Power Strength. Power Strength is probably one of the most beneficial stats you can use on a Razorwing build, specifically because it's going to deal more damage with your Dex Pixia and your the melee weapon, yes. You have Streamline and Fleeting Expertise for the efficiency. Again, 1 tab below max rank, so you can make the most of it with less capacity. Check out my modding guide if you want to know why. Prime Flow to have a max amount of energy possible, so you can stay in your Arcwing mode for as long as possible. Vitality can very easily be changed for quick thinking as well if you put a couple extra former into it. Continuity for the bit of extra duration if you do plan on using your 1 or your 3 in this mode. And then the Razorwing Blitz augment to get that stupid amount of damage out of your Arcwing mode. The other build that we're looking at is the buff and duration build. We're prioritizing a lot more duration with this one, just for the fact that you're going to be spamming your 1 and your 3. You want natural talent, so you can just spam away and not have to worry about cast time. Isn't absolutely needed. If you feel comfortable with your cast timers and just casting on the fly, then you don't need it at all. You then have as much duration as possible with things like Awkward Message, with Narrow-Minded and Continuity to make your crowd controls and your buffs last as long as possible. You've got Streamline for the efficiency, Flow for a bit of extra energy, could be Prime Flow if you so choose, Stretch to counteract narrow-minded and to affect enemies from a further distance away. You could, in theory, change this around for a bit more of a damage focus if you took away narrow-minded and then put Augur Reach on there instead, allowing your 3's damage aura to affect a wider area. Beguiling Lantern is pretty useful for this build if you want to aid your team in a bit more of a sensible fashion, but it is entirely up to you. For both of these builds, Arcane Energize is extremely useful, and as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have that, you can then put Arcane Guardian or Velocity just to make your Arcwing mode good. Even with this build, you're still going to use the Razorwing mode every now and again, just for that bit of extra damage, but it's not the priority, because you can cast these abilities whilst in Arcwing mode anyway. This is just something you can do on the fly, as well as being in Arcwing mode. In terms of the Dex Pixia and the Dewata, you would mod these like weapons that you would normally use in a similar fashion. So the Dex Pixia can be done in a status fashion or a crit fashion. I much prefer a hybrid, but going for a build like this where you're prioritizing the crit damage and then viral works extremely well, or gas damage, for example. I find this works extremely well in most situations. I'll generally swap between either gas or viral depending. Swapping out occasionally Pistol Pestilence with, say, for example, the Toxin, then Heat Charge for the cold damage to make viral. Much to the same extent, you would do the same thing with the Dewata. It's never going to really equate to the same sort of damage as the Dex Pixia, simply because you have that range. But I found that with the Dewata especially, you kind of want to prioritize a similar crit build that you would use for, say, for example, Galatine. However, building for status can work as well. Things like Drifting Contact are by no means needed, but I kind of prefer this for a Zero Former build because I don't particularly use the Dewata. You can get a lot of damage out of it, though. The thing with the Dex Pixia and the Dewata is that even without modding efficiently, they can become very powerful. What you have to realize is that the power comes from the build of the frame combined with the build of the weapons themselves. The builds I've shown you are merely what I think work best for me, and with these builds, as you've seen, I can kill level 160 enemies with absolutely no issue. So I hope this guide has been somewhat informative for you. If you love Titania's new changes, much like the vacuum they've added onto her Razorwing mode, then leave a comment down below. Tell me what you like about her changes, whether they are useful or not, and hopefully we'll see all you top hatters in the next video. Ta-ra!